So the three separate conversations included within this video regarding face coverings and their effectiveness in the wake of Nicola Dunlop's announcing that we will have to, via law of course, continue to wear them for the next 2 weeks or so due to a rise in coof cases. It's kind of got me thinking a wee bit, you know. There's been many exchanges across the Parliament, across the media, etc. in Scotland over the course of the last week since this announcement was made. I've only included a few, but the general consensus throughout all of it is that not only do the face coverings in question work, they're scientifically proven to be effective, but there seems to be a shift towards additional justifications for wearing them. From making the vulnerable feel more safe, to protecting said vulnerable, all the way to it being some sort of moral obligation or social obligation, you know, a social duty even, as if it's expected of us, common courtesy, all that bullshit. Kind of harkening back to that good old-fashioned behavioural change. I really can't help but feel that they are yet again taking ideas straight from that good old-fashioned psychological manipulation textbooks. You know, maybe Sage had been on the phone, maybe it was Jason Leach, who knows. But it's almost, to me, appears to me as if they're trying to normalise the wearing of face coverings even after it's no longer a legal requirement. You know, and one of the ways that it appears anyway as if they're going about this, or trying to go about this, is by making people feel obligated somehow. Again, harkening back to that behavioural change.
Of course, retain the ability to reintroduce measures if, for example, a new variant emerges. Then, secondly, from next Monday, 21st March, with one temporary precautionary exception, the remaining domestic legal measures will be lifted and replaced with appropriate guidance. That means on Monday, the requirement on businesses and service providers to retain customer contact details will end, and so too will the requirement for businesses, places of worship and service providers to have regard to Scottish Government guidance on COVID and to take reasonably practical measures set out in the guidance. The exception relates to the requirement to wear face coverings on public transport and in certain indoor settings. Given the current spike in case numbers, we consider it prudent to retain this requirement in regulation for a further short period. I know this will be disappointing for businesses and service providers such as daycare services. However, ensuring maximum continued use of face coverings will provide some additional protection, particularly for the most vulnerable, at a time when the risk of infection is very high, and it may help us get over this spike more quickly.
Well, so I'm not really going to make a video here preaching to the choir about the effectiveness of face coverings, or face masks, depending on who you speak to, or who's reading the script. I think most people by now know that unless it's a medical grade mask, which incidentally is what nobody is wearing, everybody seems to be wearing either snoods, some form of face covering, and there doesn't really seem to be a specific definition as to what you're supposed to wear. Other people just wear the most paper thin mask possible. So this notion of spread prevention and protection while wearing one of these items is near enough non-existent. A figment of one's imagination, a figment of the thin-lipped imagination in this instance. Everybody's supposed to be wearing face masks. There's now all of a sudden a spike in cases despite the fact that everybody's wearing face masks. So Thin-Lip's hot take is to continue to wear face masks because somehow those face masks that clearly weren't very effective because we've got a spike, but this time around, if we wear them for an additional 2 to 3 weeks, that will somehow quell the spike that was created in the first place. Yeah, okay, got it. The consensus is always that masks work. And the only criticism that seems to be coming from the Tories in this instance in regards to the Holyrood is the fact that we can't live with rules forever. So naturally, Thin-Lip's little response, you'll see in due course, is to essentially say that we know the masks work, etc. Hamza Yusuf says the same thing to Representing Borders. The segment on the Scottish equivalent of Question Time, the same thing was talked about. That the science says that they work. What science are we talking about here, like? And even in that in and of itself is somewhat misleading, because the science that they proclaim insists that face masks are effective. It's the emphasis on face masks there, you know? It seems to be a blanket term for what everybody seems to be wearing, but let's not beat around the bush here. As I said, nobody's wearing medical grade masks. So,
in 2 weeks before the Easter recess, and our expectation now is that this regulation will convert to guidance in early April. The other issue I want to cover...
Now I hope you're all sitting down. prepare yourself for this absolute hot take from Douglas Ross. You know, things pulled from somewhere. If he hadn't bought into the narrative and was playing along to some degree, he could quite easily have used the fact that it's been proven time and time again via studies that have snuck out into the media while everybody else seems to be distracted with Russia, that face nappies, the cloth masks, face cloths, whatever you will, they're relatively ineffective. Some studies, apparently, according to the Daily Mail and whatnot, going so far as to suggest they're 90% ineffective. Not like we didn't know that anyway, you know. Back in the day, remember back in 2020 when the boxes of these masks specifically said that they don't protect you from COVID, you know. All of these face nappies that people have been wearing, the toxic face masks that you can find littered all over car parks, etc., instead of being in toxic bins, waste disposal bins, etc. Digressing, you know. They don't work the same way that snoods don't work, the same way that nothing works in regards to face coverings. As I said, they're not medical grade. They're paper thin fucking masks. It's bullshit. But instead of coming away with something such as that, oh no, Douglas Ross has to still to some degree play into the narrative and come away with the most ridiculous fucking argument for Nicola Thinlips to be able to just slam dunk him back. Standard procedure in this parliament. As I said, wet wipes, but I don't think they're wet wipes because that's who they are as individuals. I think it's done by design. It has to.
To the COVID statement, over 2 years ago, our lives were turned upside down by COVID. The pandemic has had a dramatic effect on all of us. We've all had to make sacrifices. We've all lost loved ones to this virus. We've all changed our way of life. COVID has not gone away, but we have learned to live with it. The UK's world-leading vaccination scheme has been a game-changer, allowing us to move on and get back to normality. It's true that case rates are higher at the moment than any of us would like, but COVID cases were always going to rise as restrictions were eased. We can't get complacent with COVID, but we have to move forward. We can't stay stuck with COVID rules forever. That's why it will be a blow for households and businesses that the First Minister has decided to keep the face mask rules in place. The Government said last month these would be removed on the 21st of March, but now that's been delayed. Why won't the First Minister trust the Scottish public to take the steps they think are right to protect themselves and their families?
And before he even goes any further, this is what I was talking about, because he's now just given Nicola Thinlips the golden opportunity to respond with arguments such as, we know they work and it's to help quell the virus, etc. When it was a golden opportunity for him to point out the fact they're useless. But they don't do that because they're all in it.
And why are we back to this wait-and-see approach again with no firm date to allow businesses and the public to plan ahead? The First Minister said she will report to Parliament again before the Easter recess, but there is no guarantee that a positive announcement will be made then. So can the First Minister tell us what criteria her government is basing this decision on, and what will need to change for this face mask restriction to be removed at the next review? Finally, the First Minister is proposing continuing to provide testing kits for the whole population well into.
Firstly, Presiding Officer, Scotland is not stuck. Let me just remind the Chamber and indeed all of Scotland that as of Monday, every single legal measure to help us control COVID will have been lifted, with a limited temporary exception for a continued requirement to wear face coverings. Now, given the spike we're seeing in cases right now and the very high risk of infection, this helps us protect each other, and in particular during this spike it helps us to protect the most vulnerable in our communities. And
when you look at it from the perspective of the things they're talking about don't work, this all becomes farcical. Why are you extending for an additional 2 to 3 weeks the use of mandatory face coverings when they don't work? That should be the point of contention from Douglas Ross, but no, of course not.
And I think it will help us get this spike under control more quickly than might.
Oh, it's going to help us get this spike under control more quickly. The same spike that originated during a period of time when everybody was wearing the alleged face mask, or allegedly wearing the face masks that she is now insisting that we wear for an additional 2 to 3 weeks. It makes no fucking sense at all.
Otherwise be the case. And I think that's very much in the spirit of solidarity and mutual concern for each other that has characterised the public response to this pandemic over the past 2 years.
Aye, good one. So, I'm starting to talk about solidarity. And this is a common theme because it was something that was brought up as well in the Scottish equivalent of Question Time. And it kind of harkens back to the video I made a few weeks ago when Nicola Findlaps first announced that they were going to be easing the rules at some point, but then saying that when we do so, this concept of learning to live with COVID would have to involve, as to some degree, some capacity, adapting our behaviour, etc., etc. And one of the reasons that was brought up time and time again to the point where it almost came across as scapegoating was the vulnerable. So essentially it was modify your behaviour because vulnerable people exist. Bringing up the vulnerable yet again, eh?
And I think many people in Scotland will actually, in light of very high cases right now, welcome this precautionary move. And even those who may not welcome it, and there will be those I understand in that category, I think will nevertheless be accepting of that and understand the reasons for it. I will update Parliament again in 2 weeks. That's before the Easter recess. I would hope then, and the expectation, that we would convert this regulation to guidance in the early part of April. The 4th of April, of course, being the first Monday, and that would be the expectation. But I think it's right to take this approach. How we will make that decision is set out in the strategic framework that we published 3 weeks ago. In short, though, we will want to see this increase in cases stabilise. We will want to see that risk of infection at 1 in 18, according to the ONS in the most recent week, start to reduce, so that particularly the most vulnerable in our society are not at the risk that they are right now. Everybody. This will be the only legal measure that remains in place, and it will be in place for a short 2-week period of time.
And again, before she's been commended by some for this cautionary approach that she's taken. It's always a cautionary approach. She's been cautious, the slow and steady approach. Just the rules, just implementing some rules, just keeping some rules implemented via law, because the rules work, of course. That's what it's always been about. It's about ensuring the public believe that the rules work, the measures work, and all the rest of it. But the reality of the matter is, take a step back and look at it for what it is. She's extending the mandatory use of things that do not fucking work in the first place to prevent something from spreading about. I could understand it, potentially, if they actually worked, or if everybody was being told that they had to wear medical-grade face masks, etc., but that's not what we're talking about here. So this is just laughable. It's fucking laughable. Anyway.
A delay in lifting the last of Scotland's COVID restrictions, masks on public transport and in shops to stay for now.
Today, though, the First Minister slowed the pace for everyone, keeping the rules on face coverings for at least another 2 weeks.
Today does mark steady progress back to normal life and to a more sustainable way of managing this virus.
Keeps dropping in that sustainable bombshells, eh? That's done by design. It's no coincidence,
However, while cases are spiking, there is still considerable pressure on the NHS, and there is concern amongst the most vulnerable in particular. So I do ask everyone to be patient for a little while longer on face coverings.
From Monday, though, businesses will no longer have to keep customer contact details, and they won't have to follow COVID guidance.
Very strange that all these other rules are being dropped, but yeah, we're being told that COVID's on the rise, hospital beds are being filled up, etc., etc. But yeah, they're dropping all the other measures, though.
That have really struggled through this over the past 2 years, we know that, and some of those people are all young people, so we want to make sure that they feel more comfortable than ever as these restrictions are lifted. We'll stagger this at their pace to make sure they're comfortable.
Across the south of Scotland, COVID cases remain high. Nicola Sturgeon said the current spike couldn't be ignored, but the Conservatives argued it was time to ease restrictions.
It's true that case rates are higher at the moment than any of us would like, but COVID cases were always going to rise as restrictions were eased. We can't get complacent with COVID, but we have to move forward. We can't stay stuck with COVID rules forever. That's why it will be a blow for households and businesses that the First Minister has decided to keep the face mask rules in place.
Scotland is not stuck. Let me just remind the Chamber and indeed all of Scotland that as of Monday, every single legal measure to help us control COVID will have been lifted, with a limited temporary exception for a continued requirement to wear face coverings.
Despite the fact they don't work.
In Annan, shoppers were broadly supportive.
I'll keep it on as long as necessary. If that's what we need to do, then we'll do it.
I would be happy to not have to wear a mask, but I'm not sure if it's going to be safe for everybody.
I'll be wearing it for some time to come.
Back in Dumfries, the extra cleaning is carrying on. Face coverings might be set to remain for a bit longer, but here, like everywhere, they're a step closer to a more normal way of working.
Shortly after the First Minister's statement, I spoke to the Health Secretary, Humza Yousaf. Cabinet Secretary, you've got rid of almost all the compulsory restrictions in Scotland, except on face coverings. Will this make that big a difference?
So we know from the evidence that's available that face coverings are one of the most effective non-pharmaceutical interventions.
Face coverings, aye? So you're telling me that snoods are effective at preventing the spread of a virus? Paper-thin masks are effective at preventing the spread of a virus? Cloth masks are effective at spreading the preventive of a virus? It's a fucking joke, like.
And at a time when cases have been rising, hospital occupancy with COVID has been rising, then we think it's sensible to keep that non-pharmaceutical intervention that is effective and has been effective in place for just that little bit longer until...
They want you to believe that extending the period of time in which we have to wear mandatory face cloths, snoods, etc. will help to prevent or stall the spread of a deadly virus that's on the rise again, despite the fact we have been wearing the very thing that they are now talking about extending. What?
Until we get a more steady trajectory in terms of...
Well, if it is 2 weeks, though, it's not guaranteed to be 2 weeks, actually, is it? It's a review in 2 weeks.
That's absolutely right. It's a review based on the clinical data. So we would, again, look at case numbers, hospital occupancy, ICU occupancy, etc., and, of course, things like the ONS figures. So the First Minister will come back to Parliament before the Easter recess. But that 2 weeks also, remember, gives us additional time to get that additional booster into the arms of those who are eligible for that second booster, i.e. those who are over 75. And adults who are immunosuppressed.
So yesterday we learnt that the wearing of face masks will continue to be law in Scotland until at least April. Do you support the cautious approach being taken by the Scottish Government to the final coronavirus measures in Scotland?
Oh, it's so cautious to extend... There's that word again, cautious. You know, cautionary approach. Yeah. Extending the mandatory use via law for everybody to wear face coverings, despite the fact said face coverings don't work. That's the point. The point that really pisses me off about all these segments.
Support it, Rachel. What do you think?
Yeah, I think probably I do, because it's not asking people a lot to wear a face mask on public transport or in enclosed spaces.
But they don't work, so...
And it just maybe makes people a bit more rest assured that they're keeping their germs to themselves. So it just... I know anyway, going to uni, it makes me feel safe that, you know, I'm okay sitting beside somebody and talking to somebody knowing that I'm double jabbed, they're double jabbed, but we're also keeping our masks on. It doesn't seem like much.
Sure. OK, thank you for your question. Yeah, Nicola Sturgeon says this isn't quite the time yet with rates still rising in Scotland. Miles Briggs, is she right to be cautious about this?
Well, I think when you look at setting this out in law, which is what the First Minister has continued to see, I don't know necessarily we should be keeping mask wearing in law. I think for most people it's something, if that's what they want to do, that's something which many people will when they're out shopping going forward, maybe for forever now. In many other countries where they've seen these sorts of situations, that's the norm, and maybe we will just see that ourselves. But I think we need to look towards personal responsibility now, actually coming out of the pandemic, how we can try to move forward as well beyond some of these restrictions, because it is something which every opportunity there seems to be the First Minister sort of holding us back for some reason without any science ever being provided to Parliament.
I'm sorry, I have to react to that. the idea that there's no science about the fact that we're currently experiencing some of the highest levels of COVID that we've seen in the pandemic. My part of the country has the highest levels in Scotland. The science is pretty clear and the evidence is pretty clear. And I noticed evidence was kind of missing from that contribution.
They're talking about a rise in COVID cases, the highest it's been in some time. Yet this has all come about at a time when people are wearing face masks.
I'm sorry to be political about this, but at a time when levels are so high, I think it's reasonable for governments to take a cautious approach, not least because of all the people that I certainly meet who, as people who've been shielding, I spoke to somebody yesterday who was recovering from cancer. These people have a right to be heard as well, and I think with that in mind, a cautious approach is entirely evidenced and reasonable.
Yeah, but hang on, the rate here is 3 times the rate in England at the moment. So it's not working, is it, whatever we're doing?
That does not provide an argument. There's been high numbers in Northern Ireland, followed by high numbers here. There's a new variant. But that does not make a case for saying that we should at this point step back and do something that's unevidenced when it comes to face masks.
Where most people are asking the question is, in England, masks have been removed for 2 months, but rates are higher here. So there is no science.
You can point from week to week to different rates in Scotland and England, and there have been times when it's been higher in Scotland and times it's been higher in England. But the point is we have a new variant. There are public concerns about it. You've just heard some of them expressed. And I think it's entirely reasonable that we take a cautious approach. And I have to say, I get a little bit weary of the fact that the Conservatives throughout this have opposed literally every single measure in recent months that the Scottish Government has put forward on scientific advice about the subject of the pandemic. And I think that if we take the politics out of it, I think that would be a helpful thing to do.
Let me hear from the audience on this. Lady at the back with the mask on. Yes.
What had we learned from the speed run that the UK government proposed with mask mandate, isolation rules, the backwards forward strategy that was imposed, then taken off, as rates rose again when their plans failed? In Scotland, we never took that approach. So why would we take it now?
So for you, the caution is justified at the moment?
I would say caution is justified.
Katie Gagley-Swan, what do you think?
I think that the idea that the pandemic is over is wrong. Globally,
they love to remind us of that as well, you know. They all say it.
About 6,000 people every day are still dying from the virus. The Economist puts the sort of excess death rate since the pandemic began at 4 times the officially recorded death toll. And I think that we might see more fluctuations of the virus as long as many parts of the world remain unvaccinated. As long as we do not have a global vaccination strategy in place, we will continue to see new variants emerge that can come and reinfect the areas that are fully vaccinated, that are potentially resistant against our existing vaccines and potentially more dangerous. So I think it's important to get used to proportionate responses to fluctuations in transmission. And Scotland, you know, for myself personally,
get used to the rules that don't work, while we continue to pretend that they do work.
A minor inconvenience of wearing a mask
that doesn't work
is worth the possibility of protecting other people who are more vulnerable throughout the pandemic.
And there it is again, referring to the vulnerable.
Throughout the pandemic, there are people who have not been able to ever get back to normal when there haven't been lockdowns because of their specific vulnerabilities. I think that mask wearing, which is scientifically proven to be effective against transmission, part of a broader toolkit of other things like washing hands, distancing within indoor spaces, vaccination. That is the proportionate response, and I think as citizens, our individual responsibility, yes, does have to be balanced with community interests, but I think that my individual freedom is contingent on a community that respects one another, and so I, for one, do support mask mandates.
OK, Hugo, sitting next to you, arrived today from London, where it feels very different, I'm sure, for you.
Well, it depends what you mean. I mean, like, I live in London. Basically, I would say virtually everyone I know has had COVID at least once, and a lot of people have had it more than once. My daughter's class of 30 last week had 14 kids going in because the rest all had COVID. The official statistics don't seem to recognise this anymore because they're not recording them, but COVID is absolutely everywhere. As to what the law is where I live about when I should be wearing a mask, I've got to admit I don't actually know. It doesn't seem terribly important. I do know, though, that when I go out into a public place, an enclosed public place, except for pubs for some reason, because that seems to be the culture, but there you go, I put on a mask, because that's what you're expected to do. I put on a mask on the tube. Some people don't. I think it's relatively disgraceful not to these days. I think the social norms are actually more important than the law. I don't really care what the law is. I think people, when they go out in public, if they possibly can, they should be wearing a mask.
And will you continue with that? And will you continue with that for as long as you think it's necessary, yeah?
Well, I mean, when numbers are declining and there's virtually no COVID around, should such a situation ever occur again, we can only hope, then I guess I'll be more relaxed. And indeed, I am more relaxed. But these days, when numbers are going up, you think about what you're doing. You think about where you go. You think about the people you're next to. You think about the people you're next to on the train. You behave in a responsible fashion.
Let me hear from the audience.
You know, social norms. Yeah. Behavioural change.
Man in the brown jacket.
I pretty much agree with Hugo on that. It has become a matter of personal responsibility. Just look around us. I mean, yes, there are people wearing masks, but there's lots and lots of people not wearing masks. None of you are wearing masks. And therefore, we're all in danger somehow. Well, maybe we are, maybe we aren't. And the science is, at best, sketchy. It's not proven in one way or another on lots of things. You can argue the case. You can argue the case both ways about the effectiveness of masks or not. But it's kind of marginal.
Well, it would fucking help if the type of mask that they're speaking about, referring to, was specified, but it never is. You know, as I said, it's just a blanket term. But there was a study, as I said, that came out a couple of weeks ago. 90% ineffective.
I don't think you can.
The reason that people in here are either a metre apart or in family groups, let me just kind of explain.
It shouldn't really matter, though, because there's a deadly virus.
Explain that. For you, Michael Mara, is this caution justified? I mean, if we look at the rates over the course of the whole 2 years, there's not been that huge a difference between Scotland and England in terms of outcomes and all of this. Is the caution that the questioner talked about, is it justified?
Yeah, the outcomes for the whole of the UK have been pretty catastrophic, amongst the worst in the world. Let's be pretty clear on that, in terms of our record across the whole of the UK, in terms of excess deaths, in terms of the infection rate and the economic impact, the whole shebang has been bloody awful for the whole of the UK. And those, I think, in reality, there's been tiny differences between what the Scottish Government has done and what the UK Government has done, very marginal differences. Lots of differences in tone. And I actually do think that the tone matters, and I think that people are reflecting on that. There's a mark of common respect, I think, about wearing a mask and showing that you're showing respect for other people. And I get a little bit kind of confused around this kind of idea of, is it in legislation or is it in advice? You know, what that really means is about sending a signal about what the kind of social convention is to the public. Are we going to be loosening this, or are we going to be strengthening it, or staying strong around it? So actually, given the sky-high rates, and if I can, I mean, my area of work in Parliament is principally around education. And there are many parents and teachers who are incredibly concerned about the rates in schools. It's sky-high. It's absolutely massive. We have done nothing about ventilation in schools to deal with it in any other form of mitigation. An absolute disgrace across the period. But there is real concern out there, so I am comfortable with the continued position, even if it signals caution, if the reality of it is very little difference.
Everyone wants to be in a situation forevermore where we're facing restrictions, where I don't think anyone wants to be in a situation where masks are there forevermore. And I do agree with what many of the panel are saying about the need for personal responsibility in the future. However, politicians have a job, which is to try and make rules about these things and to try and make them rationally. And I think given some of the concerns that you've just expressed for people with underlying health conditions and some of what's been said about setting a tone, I think it would send out quite an alarming signal to say that it's a matter of choice whether you wear a mask on a train when figures are at the highest almost that they've ever been. So I think it's a reasonable approach to wait a couple of weeks and see what the evidence says.
I wonder, when we reach that point in a couple of weeks' time and we revisit this, if the decision is taken to do away with face coverings, who in the audience will carry on like Hugo post the decision point, deciding to wear one?
So I can only think of one of two outcomes that will occur in a few weeks' time. Either we will get an announcement that they're going to continue the use of face masks being mandatory via law. If that's the case, however, it would kind of call into question all the bullshit that they've been saying up until that point regarding the effectiveness of face masks. The other option that I can think of would be that they're going to announce that it will now be made guidance. Therefore, by law, you do not have to wear a face mask anymore if you do not wish to. It would become optional. But if that is the case, in order to get to that point, they will then have to explain that they managed to suppress the virus or get control of the rising cases, etc. And it was all down to those face masks. So subconsciously, combined with all the bullshit that I've played in this video here, and all the other bullshit that I haven't included, from all these politicians, the narrative, the rhetoric, etc., helping to cement this little narrative that the face coverings do work. Subconsciously, at that point, if it's announced that it's now optional to wear them, it might make some people still wear them anyway. Because one, they will feel that they want to do it in order to protect the vulnerable around them. And two, subconsciously, they will be of the belief that they fucking work. I don't know. Food for thought.